Wands away, she instructed them all with a smile. To those people who had been hopeful enough to take them out, sadly return them to their bags. As we finish chapter 1, last lesson, I would like you all to turn to page 19 today and commence chapter 2, Common Defense Theories and Their Derivation. There will be no need to talk. Still smiling her wide, self satisfied smile, she sat down at her desk. The class gave an audible sigh as it turned, as one, to page 19. Harry wondered dully whether there were enough chapters in the book to keep them reading throughout the year's lessons, and was on the point of checking the contents page when he noticed that Hermione had her hand in the air again. Professor Umbridge had noticed, too, and what what was more, she seemed to have worked out a strategy for just such an eventuality. Instead of trying to pretend she had not noticed Hermione, she got to her feet and walked around the front of the row of desks until they were face to face. Then she bent down and whispered, so the rest of the class could not hear. "What is this time, Miss Granger?" "I've already read chapter 2," said Hermione. "Well then, proceed to chapter 3." "I've read that too." "I've read the whole book." Professor Umbridge blinked, but recovered her poise most instantly. "Well then, you should be able to tell me what Slinkhart says about counterjinxes in chapter 15. He says that counterjinxes are improperly named," said Hermione promptly. "He says counterjinxes is just a name people give their jinxes when they want to make them sound more acceptable." Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrows, and Harry knew she was impressed, against her will. "But I disagree," Hermione continued. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows rose a little higher, and her gaze became distinctly colder. "You disagree?" "Yes, I do," said Hermione, who, unlike Umbridge, was not whispering, but speaking in a clear, carrying voice that had by now attracted the attention of the rest of the classroom. "Mr. Slinkhart doesn't like jinxes, does he? But I think they can be very useful when they're used defensively." "Oh, do you?" Professor Umbridge, forgetting to whisper, and straightened up. "Well, I'm afraid it's Mr. Slinkhart's opinion, and not yours, that matters within this classroom, Miss Granger." "But," Hermione began. "That is enough," said Professor Umbridge, and she walked back to the front of the class and stood before them. All the jauntiness she had shown at the beginning of the lesson gone. "Miss Granger, I'm going to take 5 points from Gryffindor House." But there was an outbreak of muttering at this. "What for?" said Harry angrily. "Don't you get involved," said Hermione, whispering urgently at him. "For disrupting my class with pointless interruptions," said Professor Umbridge smoothly. "I am here to teach you using a ministry-approved method that does not include inviting students to give their opinion on matters of which they understand very little. Your previous teachers in the subject may have allowed you uh, more license, but as none of them, with the possible exception of Professor Quirrell, who did at least appear to have restricted himself to age appropriate subjects, would have passed a ministry inspection." "Yeah, Quirrell was a great teacher," said Harry loudly. "There was just that minor drawback of him having Lord Voldemort sticking out the back of his head." The, the pronouncement was followed by one of the loudest silences Harry had ever heard. Then, "I think another week's of detentions would do you some good, Mr. Potter," said Umbridge sleekly. The cut on the back of Harry's hand barely healed, and by the following morning it was bleeding again. He did not complain during the evening detention. He was determined not to give Umbridge a satisfaction. Over and over he wrote, "I must not tell lies," and not a sound escaped his lips, though the cut deepened with every letter. The very worst part of the second week's worth of detentions was, just as George had predicted, Angelina's reaction. She cornered him just as he arrived at the Gryffindor table for breakfast on Tuesday and shouted so loudly that Professor McGonagall came sweeping down up upon the pair and in of them from the staff table. Miss Johnson, how dare you make such a ruckus in the great hall? 5 points from Gryffindor. But, Professor, he's gone and landed himself in detention again. What's this, Potter? Said Professor McGonagall sharply, rounding on Harry. Detention? From who? Professor Umbridge, muttered Harry, not meeting Professor McGonagall's beady, square-framed eyes. Are you telling me, she said, lowering her voice, so that the group of curious Ravenclaws behind them could not hear, that after the warning I gave you last Monday, you lost your temper with Professor Umbridge's class again? Yes, said Harry muttered, speaking to the floor. Potter, you must get a grip on yourself. You are heading for serious trouble. Another 5 points from Gryffindor. But what? Professor, no! Harry said, furious at the injustice. I'm already being punished by her. Why do you have to take points from us as well? Because detentions do not appear to have any effect on you whatsoever, said Professor McGonagall tartly. No, not another word of complaint. Potter, as for you, Miss Johnson, you will confine to your shouting matches to the Quidditch pitch in the future, or risk losing the team captaincy. Professor McGonagall strode. Sorry, my dog is like. Go. Professor McGonagall strode back towards the staff table. Angelina gave Harry a look of deepest disgust and stalked away, upon which he flung himself on the bench beside Ron, fuming. She's taking points off of Gryffindor because I'm having my hand sliced open every night. How's that fair? How? I know, mate, said Ron sympathetically, tipping bacon onto Harry's plate. She's bang out of order. Hermione, however, merely rustled the pages of her Daily Prophet and said nothing. You think McGonagall was right, do you? Said Harry angrily to the picture of Cornelius Fudge obscuring Hermione's face. I wish she hadn't taken points from you, but I think she's right to warn you not to lose your temper with Umbridge, said Hermione's voice. While Fudge gestically forcefully from the front page, clearly giving some kind of speech. Harry did not speak to Hermione all through Charms, but when they entered Transfiguration, he forgot all about being cross with her. Professor Umbridge and her clipboard was sitting in the corner, and the sight of her drove the memory of breakfast right out of his head. Excellent, whispered Ron. As they sat down in their usual seats, let's see Umbridge get what she deserves. Professor McGonagall marched into the room without giving the slightest indication that she knew Professor Umbridge was there. That will do, she said, and the silence fell immediately. Mr. Finnegan, kindly come here and hand back the homework. Miss Brown, please take the box of mice. Don't be silly, girl. They won't hurt you. And hand one to each of the students. Said Professor Umbridge, employing the same silly little cough she had used to interrupt Dumbledore the first night of term. Professor McGonagall ignored her. Seamus handed back Harry's essay. Harry took it without looking at him and saw in relief that he had managed an A. Right. Everyone listen closely. Dean Thomas, if you do that to that mouse again, I shall put you in detention. Most of you have now successfully banished your snails, and even those who are left with a certain amount of shell have got the gist of the spell. Today we shall be... said Professor McGonagall. Yes, Professor McGonagall, turning around, her eyebrows so close together they seemed to form a long, severe line. I was wondering, Professor, whether you received a note telling you of the date and time of your inspection. Obviously, I received it, or I would have asked you what you were doing in my classroom, said Professor McGonagall. Turning her back firmly on Professor McGonagall, many of the students exchanged looks of glee. As I was saying, today we shall be practicing the altogether more differently vanishment of mice. Now, the vanishment spell. I wonder, said Professor McGonagall in cold fury, turning on Professor Umbridge, how you expect to gain an idea of my usual teaching methods if you continue to interrupt me. You see, I don't generally permit people to talk when I am talking. Professor Umbridge looked as though she had just been slapped in the face. She did not speak, but straightened the parchment of her clipboard and began scribbling furiously. Looking supremely unconcerned, Professor McGonagall addressed the class once more. As I was saying, the vanishing spell becomes more difficult with the complexity of the animal to be vanished. The snail, as an invertebrate, does not present much of a challenge. The mouse, as a mammal, offers a much greater one. This is not, therefore, magic you can accomplish with your mind on your dinner. So, you know that the incantation, let me see what you can do. How she can lecture me about losing my temper with Umbridge, Harry muttered to Ron under his breath, but he was grinning. His anger with Professor McGonagall had quite evaporated. Professor Umbridge did not follow Professor McGonagall around the class as she followed Professor Trelawney. Perhaps she realized Professor McGonagall would not permit it. She did, however, take many more notes while standing in her corner, and then when Professor McGonagall finally told them to pack away, she rose with a grim expression on her face. Well, it's a start, said Ron, holding up a long, wriggling mouse tail. Dropping in the back of the box Lavender was passing around. As they filed out of the classroom, Harry saw Professor Umbridge approach the teacher's desk. He nudged Ron, who nudged Hermione in turn, and the three of them deliberately fell back to eavesdrop. How long have you been teaching at Hogwarts? Professor McGonagall asked. 39 years, this December, said Professor McGonagall, snapping her bag shut. Professor Umbridge made a note. Very well, she said. You will receive the results of your inspection in 10 days. I can hardly wait, said Professor McGonagall in a coldly indifferent voice, and she strode off towards the door. Hurry up, you three, she added, sweeping Harry, Ron, and Hermione before her. Harry could not help giving her a faint smile and could have sworn he received one in return. He had thought that the next time he would see Umbridge would be in his detention that evening, but he was wrong. When he walked down the lawn towards the forest for care of magical creatures, they found her and her clipboard waiting for them beside Professor Grubbly Plank. You do not usually take this class, is that correct? Or you do not usually teach this class, is that correct? Harry heard her ask as they arrived at the trestle table where the group of captive Bowtreckles were scrabbling around the wood lice like so many living twigs. Quite correct, said Grubbly Plank, hands behind her back bouncing on the balls of her feet. I'm a substitute teacher standing in for Professor Hagrid. Harry exchanged uneasy looks with Ron and Hermione. Malfoy was whispering with Crabbe and Goyle. He would surely love the opportunity to tell tales on Hagrid to the member of the Ministry. Said Professor Umbridge, dropping her voice, though Harry could still hear her quite clearly. I wonder. The headmaster seems strangely reluctant to give me any information on the matter. Can you tell me what is causing Professor Hagrid's very extended leave of absence? Harry saw Malfoy look up eagerly. Afraid I can't, said Professor Grumbly Plank. Don't know anything more about it than you do. Got an owl from Dumbledore. Would like a couple of weeks teaching work. I accepted. That's as much as I know. Well, shall I get started? Yes, please do, Professor Umbridge, scribbling on her clipboard. Umbridge took a different tack in the class and wandered among the students, questioning them on magical creatures. Most of them were able to answer well, and Harry's spirits lifted somewhat. At least the class was not letting Hagrid down. Overall, said Professor Umbridge, returning to Professor Grubbly Plank, side after a lengthy interrogation of Dean Thomas, how do you, as a temporary member of staff, an object outsider, I suppose you might say, how do you find Hogwarts? Do you feel you receive enough support from your school management? Oh, yes, Dumbledore is excellent, said Professor Grumbly Plank heartily. Yes, I'm very happy with the way things are run. Very happy indeed. Looking politely incredulous, Umbridge made a tiny note on her clipboard and went on. And what are you planning to cover this class this year, assuming, of course, that Professor Hagrid does not return? Oh, I'll take them through the creatures that most often show up in OWL, said Professor Grubbly Plank. Not much left to do. They've studied unicorns and nifflers. I thought we would go over portlocs and uh, knezzles, but make sure they can recognize crumps and gnarls. You know. Well, you seem to have a good idea of what you're doing at any rate, said Professor Umbridge, making a very obvious tick on her clipboard. Harry did not like the emphasis she put on you, and liked it even less when she put her next question to Goyle. Now, I hear there's been injuries in this class. Goyle gave a stupid grin. Malfoy hastened to answer the question. That was me, he said. I was slashed by a hippogriff. A hippogriff, said Professor Umbridge, now scribbling frantically. Only because he was too stupid to listen to Hagrid told him to do, said Harry angrily. Both Ron and Hermione groaned. Professor Umbridge turned her head slowly in Harry's direction. Another night's detention, I think, she said softly. Well, thank you very much, Professor Grubbly Plank. I think that's all I need here. You'll be receiving the results of your inspection within 10 days. Jolly good, said Professor Grubbly Plank, and Professor Umbridge set off back across the lawn to the castle. It was midnight, nearly midnight, when Harry left Umbridge's office that night, and his hand now bleeding so severely that it was staining the scarf he had wrapped around it. He expected the common room to be empty when he returned, but Ron and Hermione had sat up waiting for him. He was pleased to see them, especially Hermione was disposed to a sympathetic rather than critical. Here, she said anxiously, pushing a small bowl of yellow liquid towards them. Soak your hand in that. It's a solution of strained and pickled marlap tentacles. It should help. Harry placed his bleeding, aching hand into the bowl and experienced a wonderful feeling of relief. Crookshanks curled around his legs, purring loudly, and leapt into his lap, settling down. Thanks, he said gratefully, scratching behind Crookshank's ears with his left hand. He still reckon you should I still reckon you should complain about this, said Ron in a low voice. No, said Harry flatly. McGonagall's gonna go nuts if she knew. Yeah, she probably would, said Harry. And how long do you reckon it would take Umbridge to pass another decree saying anyone who complains about the High Inquisitor gets sacked immediately? Ron opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out, and after a few moments he closed it again, defeated. She's an awful woman, said Hermione in a small voice. Awful, you know. I was just saying to Ron when you came in. We've got to do something about her. I suggested poison, said Ron grimly. No, I mean something about what dreadful teacher she is, and how we're not going to learn any defense from her at all, said Hermione. Well, what can we do about that? Said Ron, yawning. It's too late, isn't it? She's got the job. She's here to stay. Fudge will make sure of that. Well, said Hermione tentatively, you know, I was thinking today. Shot a slightly nervous look at Harry, and then plunged on. I was thinking that Maybe it's time to come when we should just do it ourselves. Do what ourselves? Said Harry suspiciously, still floating his hand in the essence of Murtlap uh, tentacles. Well, learn defense against the dark arts ourselves, said Hermione. Come off it, groaned Ron. You want us to do extra work? Do you realize Harry and I are behind on homework again? And it's only the second week. But this is much more important than homework, said Hermione. Harry and Ron goggled at her. I don't think there was anything in the universe more important than homework, said Ron. Don't be silly. Of course there is, said Hermione. And Harry saw with an anxious feeling that her face was suddenly alight with the kind of fever that SPEW usually inspired in her. It's about preparing ourselves, like Harry said in Umbridge's first lesson, for what's waiting for us out there. It's about making sure we really can defend ourselves. If we don't learn anything for a whole year, we can't do much by ourselves, said Ron in a defeated voice. I mean, all right, we can go and look up jinxes in the library and try to practice them, I suppose. No, I agree. We've gone past that stage where we can just learn things out of books, said Hermione. We need a teacher, a proper one, who can show us how to use the spells and correct us if we're doing it wrong. If you're talking about Lupin, Harry began. No, I'm not talking about Lupin, said Hermione. He's too busy with the order, and anyways, the most we can see him is during Hogsmeade weekend, and that's not nearly often enough. Who then? Said Harry, frowning at her. Hermione heaved a deep sigh. Isn't it obvious? She said. I'm talking about you, Harry. There was a moment of silence. A light night breeze rattled the windows panes behind Ron, and the fire guttered. About me, what? Said Harry. I'm talking about you teaching us defense against the dark arts. Harry stared at her. Then he turned to Ron, ready to exchange an exacerbated look they sometimes shared when Hermione's elaborated on far-fetched schemes like SPEW. To Harry's consternation, however, Ron did not look exacerbated. He was frowning slightly, apparently thinking. Then he said, That's an idea. What's an idea? Said Harry. You, said Ron, teaching us to do it. But Harry was grinning. Harry was grinning now. Sure, a pair of them were pulling his leg. But I'm not a teacher. I can't. Hurry, you're the best. Harry, you're the best of the year in defense against the dark arts, said Hermione. Me? Said Harry, now grinning more broadly than ever. No, I'm not. You've beaten me in every test. Actually, I haven't, said Hermione coolly. You beat me in our third year, the only year we sat the test and had a teacher who actually knew the subject. But I'm not talking about test results, Harry. Think about what you've done. How'd you mean? You know what? I'm not sure I want someone this stupid teaching me, said Ron to Hermione, smirking slightly. He turned to Harry. Let's think, he said, pulling a face like Goyle, concentrating. First year you saved the Sorcerer's Stone from you-know-who. But that was luck, said Harry. It wasn't skill. Second year, Ron interrupted. You killed the basilisk and destroyed Riddle. Yeah, but it was Fox. If Fox hadn't turned up, Third year, Ron said louder, you fought off about 100 Dementors at once. You know that was a fluke. It was the time, if the time turner hadn't. Last year, Ron said, almost shouting now, you fought off you-know-who again. Listen to me, said Harry, almost angrily, because Ron and Hermione were both smirking now. Just listen to me, all right? It sounds great when you say it like that, but all that stuff was luck. I don't know what I was doing half the time. I didn't plan any of it. I just did whatever I could think of, and I nearly always had help. Ron and Hermione were still smirking at Harry, and Harry felt his temper rise. He wasn't even sure why he was feeling so angry. Don't sit there grinning like you know better than I do. I was there, wasn't I? He said heatedly. I know what went on, all right. And I didn't get through any of that because I was brilliant against defense against the dark arts. I got through it all because help had come at the right time or because I guessed right. But I just blundered through it all. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Stop laughing! The bowl of Murtlap essence fell to the floor and smashed. Harry became aware that he was on his feet, though he couldn't remember standing up. Where was I? Crookshanks shrieked away under a sofa. Ron and Hermione's smiles had vanished. You don't know what it's like, you. Neither one of you. You've never had to face him, have you? You think it's just memorizing a bunch of spells and throwing them at him, like you're in class or something. The whole time, you know there's nothing between you and dying except your own brain or guts or whatever. Like you think straight when you're about a nanosecond away from being murdered or tortured or watching your friends die. They've never taught us that in classes, what it's like to deal with things like that. And you two sit there acting like I'm a clever little boy to be standing here alive while Diggory was stupid and like he messed up. You just don't get it. That could have easily just been me. It would have been me if Voldemort hadn't needed me. We weren't saying anything like that, mate, said Ron, looking aghast. We weren't having a go at Diggory. We didn't. You got it all wrong. Ended the. He looked helplessly at Hermione, whose face was stricken. Harry, she said timidly, don't you see? This is exactly why we need you. We need to know what it's really like facing him, facing Voldemort. It was the first time she had ever said Voldemort's name. And it was this, more than anything else, that calmed Harry, still breathing hard. He sank back into his chair, becoming aware that as he did so, that his hand was throbbing horribly again. He wished he had not smashed the bowl of Murlap essence. Well, think about it, said Hermione quietly. Please? Harry could not think of anything else to say. He was feeling ashamed of his outburst already. He nodded, hardly aware of what he agreed to. Hermione stood up. Well, I'm off to bed, she said, in a voice that was clearly as natural as she could make it. Night. Ron had gotten to his feet, too. Coming? He said awkwardly to Harry. Yeah, said Harry. In a minute. I'll just clear this up. He indicated the smashed bowl on the floor. Ron nodded and left. Reparo, he muttered, pointing his wand to the broken pieces of china. They flew back together, good as new, but there was no returning the Murtlap essence to the bowl. He was suddenly so tired, he was tempted to sink back into the armchair and sleep there, but instead he forced himself to his feet and followed Ron upstairs. His restless night was punctured once more by the dreams of the long corridors and locked doors, and he woke up the next day with his scar prickling again. Good night, guys.